Okay, so now in Skills 9, we're gonna put the rubber to the road a bit about this. This section is entitled Viewing the Outline as the Backbone, and I feel like we've thought a little bit like this along the way, but we're gonna do it in a very literal way now. So what now? Imagine for a second, you have an outline in the style we've been discussing, or I give you an outline, which is closer to what's actually happening at this particular juncture. So what do you do with it? Well, it's very easy. Imagine you wanted to write from that outline. It's easy to lose the thread of argumentation during writing. It's very easy, right? Because you're trying to keep a bunch of thoughts in your head at the same time. So sometimes we wander off into a whole new area, which is not conducive to the point we're making. So it's important that, assuming you've put appropriate amount of time into laying out the argument in outline form, and again, it's different than if you're writing about jelly beans, and you know very well the 3 reasons you like jelly beans. An argument takes a lot more information. So keeping that all in your brain is very hard. So when you go to take your ideas that you've constructed in a very reasonable way and try to put it down on paper, it can be lost. You don't want to lose that work, okay? So to that end, my suggestion at this stage of writing now, if you keep working on writing of this type for years and years and years, you will be in a different situation. But right now, while we're learning to do these things, I want you to think of the outline as a skeleton of the eventual argument. That means that to the extent possible, don't change the order. I'll talk more about these in a second. And transitioning is, of course, important. In fact, I wrote transition, transition, transition because I'm slightly annoying like that, but it's fine. So when I say think of it as a skeleton of the eventual argument, what you're doing is using existing points or subpoints. So, we've been talking about section headers and points under it. So that section header is kind of a point, and then there's things underneath it that kind of spell out the argument. You almost think of them as topic sentences for paragraphs, almost, okay? I'm not telling you with a whip that you must do it that way, but if you are struggling to learn this or are trying to learn to do this, it helps until you've mastered it to kind of go about it in a dry sort of way, right? To be super dry, like several days old French bread or whatever, and be very dry, right? Be somewhat literal, because the more you spice things up, the more you start adding in the butters and whatnot, unless you have a lot of experience, you end up adding things that you may later regret, you can't take off, like truffle oil is nowhere near as delicious as people would make you think. And unless you know that, you might add it to your bread and then later regret it when your bread tastes kind of dirt. Okay, some people love it, kudos, but I think it is overblown, I'll say, in my opinion. But cool. Anyway, so at this point, again, if you want to be more spicy and you have experience doing this, you do you. But if this is newer to you, and in my experience with this class is that it's a newer thing for most of us, be a little bit on the dry side, okay? Try to be a little bit, follow the argument more closely. In fact, if you were to color code the various points of the outline and then transfer them over to your writing, you'd see the color sentences heading each paragraph practically, right? Followed by some content that supports each thought. And if you are ever to do this, so even imagine that you're writing for me and you're going to copy paste it over to your homework or whatever, and when you're doing it at home or in your Word document or whatever, you could literally color code stuff if you wanted to. And especially if you're writing at length, you know, you might see a pattern where the subpoints that you're making to support an argument might be spaced out, like this paragraph is about this point, and this paragraph is about that point, and this, it depends on the scale, because you could write stuff really smushed together, like one squishy little paragraph, or you could spread them out and, make an actual argument, but you probably would see that. Now, some people, or some outlines that you find, might have a lot of information under their subpoints, right? So if I were to give you an outline that had really dense, thick subpoints, when you go to discuss them, those things will reappear in those paragraphs. What I'm saying is simply that as you're spreading out this information, depending on how much information is in the bullet point, it might just be sort of topic-y, sentency, or it might be spread out a little bit more. Anyway, imagine this here, okay? And we're going to talk about this in a little more detail in a second. But notice how I said you could literally color code stuff. The left would be kind of an outline like we've been talking about, and the right would be sort of like we were talking about with the layout of the actual writing piece, the lit review or whatever, and notice how it's in sort of the same order and it's just blown out a little bit. Okay, but we'll come back to this in a second. Now, when I say don't change the order, as I said, we put stuff in a particular order because, you know, anytime you're making a logical argument, stuff feeds into each other. You don't like claim something's important and then define it. You will define it and then claim it's important. And these are the kind of things. Arguments build on themselves in orderly fashion. It means if you're happy, if you write an outline or you see an outline, you're happy the way it's laid out, you should keep it in that layout. Similarly, if I hand you an outline with a particular set of bullet points, hypothetically, you shouldn't need to reorganize that. Now, that's not necessarily true if I'm handing you something, but there's a good chance they're in that order for a reason. And in fact, it's tempting to kind of do that. But unless it's absolutely necessary, since we're going for like dry toast right now, maybe we don't want to do that. We're not quite to that point, right? It's more important to keep the fidelity of the argument than it is to sound really nice when you're writing. You know, we want to sound nice, but fidelity is a little bit more important. And of course, transitioning. I just want to kind of make this point too, because sometimes I think we forget that these things are what makes our arguments flow and make sense. So even though you could use the subpoints as like topic sentences, let's say if you're using that model, or if you're just writing it all into one paragraph and it's just you just turn it all into sentences in a paragraph, you want to make sure you transition between the ideas or the paragraphs depending on the size, right? So things like, in spite of the effect of blah, 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 this happens, right? Or given that, or on the other hand, these have sort of semantic meanings, right? In spite of the effect of is sort of like, you know, it's kind of an X but Y kind of feeling, right? Like I've told you this thing that's very convincing and it's, you know, and it has an effect. But now I have a whole different thing that you would think would be affected by the first thing, but it isn't, right? So in spite of this first effect, this other thing. Or given that, so the second one, given that, you know, the first thing you lay out would be like, well, given that we've shown all this stuff, this second part makes total sense, right? On the other hand, is sort of is literally direct counter evidence, right? In spite of the effect of, it's kind of like I did a whole construct, here's a different construct that is not related that you think it would be. Given that is here's a construct and here's another construct that's related. On the other hand is sort of two sides of the same construct. So transitions are not, you know, hypothetical. They have purposes, right? They have semantic meanings that indicate the relationship. It's like, however, we use the word however all the time. And conversationally, however, is just kind of like anyway, however, or it's very like non-specific. Whereas however is intended to be a contrast, right? And I think we know this, but we don't use it in a very technical way sometimes, right? Or we'll use given that, and then the thing that follows, like the two pieces, the thing that's given and the thing that's related to the given that thing. Sometimes they're not really related when we're talking in general speech. We're just like, anyway, there's this thing and now this other thing. We don't use them technically. And so what I'm pointing out to you is the relationship between ideas as expressed with these kinds of transitions are important. Otherwise, it's just like, here's a thought, here's a thought, here's a thought, here's a thought, and you don't really see how they're connected. And so these are things you should be kind of thinking about. If you were going to write at length, for example, imagine that you had a whole subsection on verbal aptitude, right? And this ends up being 3 big paragraphs or something. Sometimes it's nice to have like a concluding statement or something, like, ergo, verbal aptitude is super important. Whatever it is you want to say about that section, sometimes it helps. It's a question of the length of the document. So if you were writing, let's say, a senior thesis and that bad boy was like 20 pages long or something, you might want to have concluding statements, right? So you don't lose track of what you're talking about. Because you have to keep in mind your readership is not always paying extremely close attention. Sometimes it helps to remind them. Or to make sure that if you didn't make your thought convincingly, they go, oh, did they conclude that? Oh, hang on. And they go back up and they look for it, right? It's also there to kind of cover you so that you know, people know what you intended. All right, so I said we're going to come back to this, and I just want to talk it through a little bit slower. We won't spend a ton of time doing this, but just to kind of see what I mean when I'm talking about translating it directly from the skeleton-y piece over into the actual writing. Imagine that my introduction, it had some background information and my question is there and my thesis to it, right? And this was the outline that I wrote back for the car color thing I talked about at some point. The actual content's not super important. But imagine, so this is what I have in my outline on the right. So I wrote an intro. So now this is a paragraph, roughly, let's say, right? And I wrote an intro and I'm motivating the hypothesis. I'm like, ooh, boy, why am I talking about car colors and personalities? Might help with marketing, cool. And so I asked the question, how do these relate? And so then my thesis is this choice of car colors predicted by personality type, okay? All right, so then I've taken this the first bullet point for introduction, and then the right simulating what that paragraph would look like, right? Motivate the question, ask the question, and answer it. And then the body looks something like this, right? So imagine there's actually 3 subsections. The third one's living on the next page, but it's the same idea, right? So first subsection is personalities differ by factors, including extrovert and introvert personalities, right? And because it's an outline, I've written this in a very short way. But imagine under that subsection, I'm saying things like, oh boy, there's this kind of introvert and that kind of extrovert. Here's a theory for how they differ or whatever, right? Ways to code it, perhaps operationalizations. And that's my first subsection. My second one's car color types fall into categories they price and brightness. Ooh, and there's this one, and it's bright versus dim, and there's red and blue versus something else, and however they're operationalizing it, right? Which is, if you're going to make an argument about the relationship between car color and personality, we should know something about both of those constructs, right? And so then when I'm making paragraphs, if I'm writing this in a full length ordeal, it might make sense to have an optional section header like, all right, on personalities. And then there's a section introducing the idea. Personalities differ by blah, 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 blah. And I'm going to talk about these different points. And then I spend maybe a paragraph talking about the first definition about, I don't know, the first definition is extrovert and introvert has to do with this theory. And then paragraph 2 is, well, there's a specific theory for extroverts. And paragraph 3 is, oh yeah, and a specific theory for introverts. Or, and hypothetically, as you can see here with the colors, I'm kind of blowing it out to those subpoints that are either literally topic sentences or generally just speaking topics of these paragraphs. That's kind of what I'm saying, It's turned into the skeleton, right? The skeleton is the hard bits in the middle and all the meat's around it, right? So that's the idea. And then again, you would repeat this for sections 2 and 3. It would turn into multiple paragraphs likely, okay? You can do this more succinctly as well, right? Smush them together. In our example we're going to do in a second is more smushed. And yes, we're doing this in a second. And then, of course, in the conclusion, you would have things like data suggest X. You have a little bit of summarization, a so what statement. And if you're writing that kind of thing, you might have an optional research question or a hypothesis or whatever goes here, right? So you're kind of, why do we care? It's just usually, we don't know this thing now. This is what we know, this is what we don't know, ergo, here's my hypothesis or my research question or whatever. And again, optional header. I really like headers between sections. That's just me. It helps a lot. Well, it's not just me, actually. It's a pretty popular choice in this kind of writing, almost like a report, because you want to make it easy on your reader. I don't think I can stress that enough. You want to make it easy on your reader. Some people write out, this is very common actually, the sort of the blueprint for the entire document at the end of the intro. They go, oh, this is my research question, cool. Now, I'm going to answer this by section 1 is on blah, blah, blah. Section 2 is on blah, blah, blah. Methods and results from sections, blah, blah, blah. That's very normal. It's very normal because you want to make it easy on your reader. So anyway, so if I'm doing it the way I've been doing the previous sections in this outline, I would say, okay, optional header, conclusions, or summary, and then you write a paragraph or whatever that restates your points. But what you're trying to get to is the so what statement or the research question or the hypothesis, right? Now you're trying to tie it back into this is what we don't know, ergo, go forth and do a study. Okay, this is what I mean. What we're going to do is write a paragraph based on what would be essentially one of the subpoints, the major subpoints, right? The headings. So I'm giving you the pieces of information, and we're going to write together, which means I'm going to give you a second. You can pause. When I mean give you a second, I'm going to encourage you to pause. So try to write up a paragraph based on this information. As you can see in the light colors before and after, this could be part of a larger argument where in a previous section or paragraph, I've just defined the critical period. This second one is about the fundamental difference hypothesis specifically, and then the following section is about adult second language acquisition and fossilization, because you could kind of build a story around that and have a study. All right, so the chunk that I want you to build a paragraph off of, or two if you really want, is this, right? So major point, fundamental difference hypothesis, the second language critical period theory. And then we describe it, right? First and second language acquisition differ by age, one is during and one is after the critical period. I've cited Selinker here because Larry Selinker was the first one to say there might be a critical period for L2. He's the first one to he gets cited for that, I should say. Selinker has a much longer career, but he gets cited for this particular fact or idea. And then second language acquisition, sensitive external factors, and first acquisition isn't. So this is Blave-Roman. And therefore the FDH is that after the critical period, sensitivity external factors, because learning language is different, i.e. no UG. And this is outline format, right? It is dry, dry, dry. Okay, so go ahead and pause and jot this down and try to make a paragraph. And now that you've unpaused, let's talk this through. This is the very first version. I actually made 3. This very first version is I've literally taken the outline, copy pasted it, and turned it into sentences after another. And it doesn't read all that well, right? Fundamental difference hypothesis, Blave-Roman 1989, is a second language critical period theory. First and second language acquisition differ by age, one during and one after critical period. Second language acquisition is sensitive to external actually, I need to add is. And first isn't. FDH, therefore, after critical period, sensitive external factors because language learning differently. No UG. Okay. So here's my first pass revision. Blue is everything that changed. Ha! It's a lot. So please don't copy paste. It's not enough. Well, you don't just copy paste. It's a good place to start, right? So, all right. So what did I do? Now I've added in things like the and is and so forth. Okay. So now I have the fundamental difference hypothesis is and I said a theory within the study of second language acquisition that proposes a critical period effect. Okay. Because second language critical period theory is it's really densely packed, right? It's I'm using the word propose here because I'm trying to say this is one that says this. I think I used propose twice in this paragraph. It's fine. Specifically, first language acquisition occurs. Instead of saying one during and one after, I said occurs during the critical period, and second language acquisition begins after it. It begins after it, right? Because there's no implication of completion. Okay, and then the next one, because it's Blave-Roman's theory, now I've flipped it so he's the subject. So I yanked the citation out of the end of the sentence and put it in line as part of the sentence, part of the grammar, like he. Blave-Roman, 1989, proposed that second language acquisition is sensitive to external factors, and I've added examples. What a thought. Those are really helpful, right? Such as instruction and negative evidence. And first language acquisition isn't. Blave-Roman's fundamental difference hypothesis uses this observation as the evidence for a critical period effect, After the critical period, learners are sensitive to external factors because they're learning language using different mental mechanisms, i.e. no UG, right? Because using something domain general will be a different mechanism than using domain specific UG. And again, when we talk UG emergentism, this may make slightly more sense. That's okay. All right, so this is and here it is cleaned up. So this is my first crack at it, okay? So I've added in the and is and turned it into better sentences. I've spelled out some stuff a little better. I've added examples. I reframed the thing about the fundamental difference hypothesis, right? So I just said after critical period, sensitive to external because learning differently. But now I said it uses the observation as evidence, right? I'm telling you what the relationship between, that observation about external and internal factors is and the fundamental difference hypothesis, right? In this case, I'm saying it's the evidence, right? Okay. So here's my third version. So I kept a lot of it, right? I found it a little bit redundant to say one difference is age of acquisition, specifically blah, blah, blah. So I just said one difference is age of acquisition in that first language. So I just said in that, I kind of smushed them a little bit. Something I added, which I thought was an important transition, is saying, like other critical period theories, because it's important to remember, this is only one. Like other critical period theories, Blairo proposed the second language acquisition is less consistently successful. So here we go, motivation for this kind of study, due to linguistic or cognitive differences. So now I'm spelling it out, right? And this is going to link to somewhat to the previous paragraph about critical period. It depends on how much I set up there, right? And he argued that second language learners are comparatively more sensitive to external factors, right? And so you can see that kind of gets to the point, right? It's comparatively more sensitive as compared to first language. So now here I've said, well, I guess to say hypothesizes maybe isn't ideal, but you get what I'm going for. The FDH hypothesizes that, right? So instead of uses as evidence for, it hypothesizes that the difference is, so the difference between, you know, well, yeah, the difference is hypothesized. It's fine. For now, it's fine. The difference is a critical period effect, right? After the critical period. So the difference, the causes need to be more or less sensitive. Anyway, so my point with doing another version here is that look what I've added, right? I've kind of smushed some things back together. But now, for example, the transition, like other critical period theories, I would say that's really important, right? And I've contextualized what critical period theories are in that sentence, right? Second language acquisition is less consistently successful due to linguistic or cognitive differences, right? It's kind of making that argument. So now it's not simply his theory said X, his study found X. It's trying to look at it a little bit more in terms of why does it matter? Trying to add some voice to this, okay? And the cleaned up version, which is very similar. So again, if I was trying to argue it's a critical period theory, they differ by age, it's extensive external factors, and after the critical period, it's because you don't have UG, and this is the version I came out with. All right. So something that I would assume you will do now, because you have a version and I have a couple of versions, is you'll look at how I handled this argument a little differently. I'm not saying this is the best one. As I'm reading, I'm realizing using hypothesizes and difference in the final sentence isn't necessarily ideal. And so I would have a version 4, maybe a version 5, right? If you guys write 3 versions of something, I'll be very happy because that's good. I'm not asking you to give them to me. But, writing this kind of thing well takes a little bit of time. It takes some time to go back and you reread it and go, okay, am I giving enough context for this? So as we're learning to do this, this is a very... it's something that's sort of an iterative process. And as I had said earlier this week in my little check-in video, it is a question of time. If you think you're going to sit down for an actual paper, this is not an actual paper, this is a chunk. For an actual paper, even if it's 3 to 5 pages, and you think you're going to bust it out in 2 to 3 hours and have it be any good, delusional, because it's not how that works. You must write multiple versions for it to be genuinely good. Some of that time is dedicated to finding sources. Some of that time is editing. Some of that time is thinking, right? And when I say finding sources, then you got to read them. So it is a time-intensive process, and you should always assume that. So even if you're just reading an article, which isn't this precisely, but it's, this sort of skills help you take them apart, you should be spending time, to kind of, in the different sections, you should allocate time to various tasks, okay? So please take that seriously, all right? So, to that end, the skills homework for this week is to be writing a paragraph in this general sense, okay? Again, I will give you a short outline similar to what you have here, and you will write something up. If you, you do not need to include more information than what's in that outline, but if something is something we've talked about extensively in class, like what is the critical period, I do think you should know that. Okay, so do keep that in mind. There are some things in this course that we've talked enough about you should know and you should be responsible for, okay? So if I use a technical term in the outline that you are supposed to know because it's in our glossary, because you're supposed to know the words in our glossary, then make sure you understand that. And if you feel like it's not immediately obvious reading your sample what that word is, hey, maybe you ought to explain it. In paraphrase, do not quote. We do not quote in scientific writing. It's a bad look, okay? Paraphrase. And if you want to give a page, cool, whatever, I don't care, all right? Paraphrase means say it in your own way. All right, so, okay. And so for this, if you, I encourage you, you can peruse one or more of the sources that I posted. Again, I posted two. The second one, the Kamler and Thompson, is a little more relevant for today's task because they talk about pitfalls in writing and it's really in using sources. So I encourage you to browse that. You don't have to do that, but if you find yourself being challenged by this task, that is certainly a way to tackle it. All right, so see you soon and have fun.